Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for coming today to the third Getty Graduate Symposium. I'm Mary Miller, Director of the GRI, the Getty Research Institute. You, our audience and interlocutors today, are in many locations, and you may even be on other continents, other countries, and many far from Southern California, where I work, and I stand today on ancestral Tongva and Gabrielino territory. Welcome. Because of COVID, I suspect that not all of our visitors and speakers today have visited the GRI. We look forward to the day when you do, when you visit our library, the largest art history library in the world, and which has continued to grow and expand in COVID with massive new acquisitions devoted to Latin America, Caribbean, African, Chinese, and African American collections. We cannot access these collections yet, but they're safe in shrink wrap, awaiting cataloging and more, and then awaiting the scholars. We hope some of you who are listening today who will explore their contents. Our special collections have grown as well. Fantastic collections of contemporary photographers, letters and correspondence, quite recently of Alice Rahon, papers of art historians and dealers, and I'm just scratching the surface of what is new in COVID times. We're going to be eager to bring you in the door. I'm thinking of all the things we would have done for this conference, this symposium in a normal year, but I'm still new enough to the Getty. I only came in 2019, that I feel as though this conference and I have about the same experience at the Getty. I welcomed young scholars at the symposium in person just a year ago in its second iteration, in a year that had already seen our residential scholars having to pack suitcases and flee during the Getty fire. Our scholars at Getty for a year of art and ecology in 2019-2020 began to wonder whether the topic of the year was a prediction. You know how the next chapter begins with worldwide shutdowns, but just a year ago, none of us could see what would lie ahead. This scholar year's theme is the fragment, so obviously we need to be exquisitely careful in selecting themes going forward. Art and happiness at Getty, anyone? We're delighted that you are here with us this year. And we're so happy to meet you on screen and to feel the reward of all the planning that goes into our time with you over the next few days. Nominated by your departments and programs, we feel not only excitement for your individual work, but we also get that sense of generation that you embody. Like the scholars who have historically attended the Frick Symposium in New York City, perhaps some of the advisors on this very screen, and which has been in existence since 1940. And now I have to tell you that the famed department of Bryn Mawr was allowed to join in that very first year as an all-women's institution. It was only allowed to send one graduate student, while Harvard and Columbia and all the other largely male institutions got to send two. In any case, just to say that being a part of this symposium is an honor that tracks with you from this moment onward and establishes you in a relationship to the others who will speak over the next 3 days. You create new knowledge, and having you here with us is a thrilling next step in 2021. And now I turn this over to the individual whose brainchild this was, Rebecca Peabody, the head of research projects at the GRI. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Peabody, head of research projects and academic outreach here at the Getty Research Institute, and one of the organizers of today's event. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third annual Getty Graduate Symposium. The symposium is the result of a series of collaborations that started several years ago when we reached out to the chairs of departments at each of the 9 schools represented here today and asked if they would join us in putting together an event to showcase the work of emerging scholars from research universities across California. Each of our 9 partner institutions nominates a graduate student along with a faculty advisor to represent their department and school. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome Amy Ogata back to the virtual stage this year on Sunday as one of those faculty advisors. It's thanks to Amy and her vision and initiative that we started the conversation that ultimately led to this event. Last year, we added an exciting new component to the event in the form of a pre-symposium workshop called How to Conference, aimed at undergraduate and master's level students in art history and curatorial studies who are learning how to engage with professional academic events. I'm pleased to say that we organized the workshop again this year, reaching out to students at our 9 partner schools, our neighboring Cal States, our collaborators at the Atlanta University Center Consortium. This furthers our vision of an event, or now a cluster of interrelated events, that reach out to and connect scholars at all stages of their careers. This event is an important one for us, as it allows us to deepen our commitment to graduate education by showcasing and supporting the work of our emerging scholars, by providing a stage and a stepping stone in their professional careers, by connecting with art history departments across the state, and by contributing to the scholarly community that does so much to sustain us all. Many thanks are always in order, as this is truly a group effort. I want to start by thanking everyone here today for helping us maintain the annual rhythm of this event in spite of the challenging circumstances. While I would prefer to be speaking with you in person at the Getty, I am truly grateful for your help in making sure that we are able to carry on with and even expand the scope of the event this year. Specifically, I would like to thank each of our partner institutions who are indicated in the program, our speakers and their advisors, the participants in our workshop earlier this week, and our audience. At the GRI, Mary Miller and Andrew Perchuk for their continued support, Kim Richter and Kristen Juarez for their expertise and leadership in our workshop, Peyton Phillips Quintanilla for her help with grouping the abstracts, and Sue Kang, Chelsea Anderson, Jennifer De La Fuente, and our great AV team who all do so much behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly. A couple of quick notes about our program. We will have 3 sessions made up of 3 speakers each. In the interest of limiting screen time while maintaining the momentum of our conversation, we've spread those sessions out over the next 3 days, convening today, tomorrow, and Sunday from 1 o'clock until 2:30. Within each session, we will move through the presentations without breaking for individual questions, but we've reserved time at the end of each session for discussion of the papers, as well as questions from the audience. As questions occur to you, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can do this at any time. There's no need to wait until the discussion to submit questions. And with that, I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Christine Mugnolo, along with her advisor, Cecile Whiting, both of whom are joining us from the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Cecile. Christine.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Christine Mugnola, who graduated from Princeton University, magna cum laude, with a BA in art history and a certificate in visual arts. She then went on to complete an MA in art history at the Courtauld and 2 MFA degrees. I don't know if she's a glutton for degrees or for punishment, but she enrolled in the PhD program in visual studies at UCI, happily for us, while teaching, and she has continued to teach in the art department at Antelope Valley College, where she's an associate professor. She is currently nearing completion of her dissertation, which is entitled The Adolescent in American Print. Christine has an article forthcoming excerpted from the dissertation in an edited volume on comics and art history. Indeed, her dissertation looks at images of male adolescents within the rising illustrative genres of newspaper comics and magazine illustration in the early 20th century. Today, her talk is titled Norman Rockwell versus the Progressive Era, Adolescent Anarchy and Plasmatic Insurgence. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Cecile, and especially for all your guidance and insight and support through this work. And thank you to the Getty and everyone here for bringing this together. I'm truly excited and honored to be a part of it. So today I'm going to be talking about Norman Rockwell, the 20th century illustrator famous for his Saturday Evening Post covers. And often the question that follows the statement is, why? And it's true, he's earned quite a few unenviable epithets from art historians, many of which stem from Clement Greenberg's original characterization of Rockwell as capitalist anesthesia for the masses. But here I'd like to look more closely at Rockwell's appeal. So I don't propose to challenge Greenberg and tip Rockwell into the avant-garde category. However, I do believe his images complicate their performance as kitsch by harnessing another visual medium, and that's cartooning and comics. So many of Rockwell's most iconic works incorporated a body slapstick approach to cartooning. And this was a newfound style associated with the first Sunday funnies introduced in the 1890s. So today's Sunday comics come off rather insipid when you compare them to these early Sunday supplements, which were experimental and raucous affairs. By adapting the language of comics, Rockwell harnessed its associations with anarchic play and marginalized voice. Specifically, he harnessed these qualities to stringy adolescent boy bodies. Now, these images might strike a sentimental chord today, but at the time, adolescence was a signpost to deeply festering anxieties about social hierarchies in America's future. So this presentation examines Rockwell's work through the lens of two turn-of-the-century inventions, the concept of adolescence and the newspaper comic strip. I will explore how this combination created an exothermic reaction that pushed back against pseudoscientific and social Darwinist theories on masculine development. And while you can find these cartoony adolescents really peppered everywhere through Rockwell's works, I'm going to be focusing here explicitly on his work for Afloat and Ashore. And this was a small naval magazine he illustrated during his 3 months of military service at the end of 1918. So prior to his arrival at the naval camp in Charleston, North Carolina, the 23-year-old Rockwell was already a famous illustrator. So he was quickly conscripted to draw war bond campaigns. And his heartwarming graphic here, His Gift to Her, embodies what we tend to expect from a Rockwell, a sentimentalized depiction of conservative small-town America. A white-haired woman gazes blissfully at a portrait of her deployed grandson as she raises a Liberty Bond against her heart. So Rockwell's illustration plays on assuaging chords of American family values in a peaceful home front. However, if you turn to page 4, we confront an entirely different naval spread. With radically warping anatomy, this comic crafts a grotesque display of American abject types. So no gifts for grandma to be found here. This dramatic contrast of styles actually highlights one of Rockwell's less acknowledged strengths, and that's he had this chameleon-like ability to adapt his style to his clients' various commercial goals. And Afloat and Ashore was no exception. Rockwell's Bond campaign sold faith in national victory by picturing effortless American masculinity and national solidarity in tightly rendered, elegant illustrations. Rockwell also wielded this style for morale-boosting images. So in Is This You?, Rockwell compares a disparate Navy dreamer to an active fighter. For the sulky sailor, Rockwell compromised his pose and expression, but not his masculine physique or his visage, suggesting only resolution and will was required for American heroics. Visions of classical strength and smooth-featured fierceness embodied not only American masculinity, but also perceptions of a nation newly matured into a world leader. In contrast, Rockwell's lineup of American eccentrics directly thwarts this message. His subjects range from a lollipop-headed sissy to the long-faced hayseed and a trapezoidal skulled militant. Rockwell's image recirculates visual stereotypes that were already well established as stock comic reliefs. And such cartoons typically drew from a narrow menu of features and played on the reader's ability to recognize the ethnic shorthand. Often, the intent was to castigate minorities and reinforce Anglo-Saxon superiority, and Rockwell's image could be seen to support a similarly homogenizing and rectifying function. His subtitles speak directly to the naval reader, prompting him to recall annoying speech patterns and properly codify social misfits. Yet, this was also a cartooning format taken up by micro-communities, including college humorists. College humor magazines originated in the late 19th century, and initially they copied the satirical format of elite humor magazines like Puck and Judge. But by the early 20th century, college humorists began departing from these models by including comics that were both more raucous and more self-deprecating. So here, C.H. Walcott's take on comparative heads explores the many ways in which white American masculinity manifested as this sort of like farcical flop. On the college campus, such cartoons destabilized the college's promise to cull and nurture the nation's best and brightest. So, does Rockwell's lineup ride the same satirical edge? Well, the more mature, bookending figures of Saul T. Boss and You Are Nobody certainly evoke a masculine development gone wrong. Each push toward an incurable extreme of male savagery and over-civilized ineptitude. And Rockwell's I Know It All, a gawky adolescent with acne and an Adam's apple, specifically echoes the pathetic bravado seen in cartoons of college lower-classmen. However, in other cartoons, Rockwell leaves the castigating format and prompts the reader to identify with a cartoon protagonist through a shared experience. So Male Line tracks the physical and moral degradation of the seamen as he waits 2 hours for a letter that never arrives. The cartoon actively toys with the Navy man's physiognomy as he relaxes from fine form to begins to weaken and legs begin to give way. These images recall that comparison Rockwell created for the morale boosting "Is This You?" However, in the cartoon version, military deportment becomes an affected performance, such as when the seaman must jump to salute officer, rather than a mental state. So like Rare Birds, Male Line borrowed an established trope, the sequential slapstick strip. And typically these strips explored an escalating crescendo of chaos, often instigated by a disruptive outside force, a visualization of what Tom Gunning described as the shocks and jolts of modern life. Rockwell's Male Line, though, veers from this model by avoiding a predictable escalation. Instead, Rockwell depicts a pulsing, wavering model of fatigue. Internal worry and sentimental false hope replace the outside destructive force. That manly physique promised by army life and apparent in the initial broad-chested fine form figure evaporates as the character slumps into a series of rubbery bends. And by the end of the cartoon, that character's sunken chest, his lanky limbs, and giant ears recall the uneven gawkiness of youthful adolescence. This approach to cartooning accords with an essential animative aspect of early 20th century cartoons that historian Scott Buchotman has termed plasmatic possibility. Buchotman uses plasmatic to describe the cartoon figure's transformative metamorphic freedom. He pairs the allure of plasmatic possibility with the early 20th century's contradictory notion of time. So to use Buchotman's terms, time of the progressive era was unbound, mutable, and multiple, while also rigid, deterministic, and bound to linear coherence. So I'd like to argue here that Rockwell was pushing back on a similar dichotomy, but related to masculinity, which, like time, was framed as both unbounded yet deterministic and rigid yet mutable. In Rockwell's image, these contradictions collapse and implode on the cartoonish body, specifically that of the adolescent. So here I'd like to turn to that concept of adolescence and what it signified for the progressive era. In 1904, adolescence was famously codified by George Stanley Hall. Hall defined this pliable mutative stage as occurring between the ages of 14 and 24, placing many of Afloat and Ashore's readers, and thus Rockwell's characters, within this volatile period. Hall perceived childhood as recapitulating the evolutionary history of the species. So under Hall's theory, a phase of pre-adolescent savagery was unavoidable and stimulated necessary strength and protective provider instincts. On that path toward adulthood, then children would advance toward a humanistic learning of culture and a stage marked by increased bodily plasticity and individuality. Now, within Hall's descriptions, asymmetrical bodily development was necessary to catalyze bone and muscle production, which could cause exaggerated flexibility and abnormal positions. However, within America's image and print culture, the only bodies that exhibited this hallmark clumsiness were typically aberrant lower class bodies, particularly children. Their lanky and misshapen proportions marked both their malnutrition and alarmingly premature gallop into adulthood. Their self-reliance and bravado made them threatening specimens, and also the perfect contenders to invade 1890s comic strips. In these strips, juvenile and adolescent figures gleefully fobbed off authority figures and defied social protocols. And Rockwell, with his style, was channeling their humor and resilience into his adolescent enlistees. Yet he was also walking a thin line between mirth and dissidence, because by World War I, political analysts and social commentators had also loaded adolescence as a heavy and fraught political metaphor. Essays and editorials frequently portrayed the country's rapidly changing social climate in terms of a national adolescence. So adolescent bodies that were attenuated or malformed presented as troubling harbingers of America's future. Adolescence thus manifested as a contradictory cultural model. Only a smooth transition into masculine adulthood, however uncharacteristic of adolescence itself, provided reassurance of a strong, leading Anglo-Saxon progeny. In Manhood in America, historian Michael Kimmel charts how, by the end of the 19th century, self-made manhood had eclipsed competing masculine ideologies. Moral and physical development became formalized into a civic duty and a measurable quality, and models of robust youths, who promised to transform into robust men, circulated prolifically in the visual culture of World War I. They appeared on magazine covers, advertisements, and campaign posters, many of which were actually authored by Norman Rockwell himself. And many of the articles in Afloat and Ashore similarly reassured how military service could rehabilitate masculine development. On August 7th, 1918, an article described how the Naval Athletic Director, aware he needed to, quote, prepare boys coming from farms, schools, and offices properly, end quote, sought athletics as a finishing process to make them, quote, clean of mind, keen of eye, and strong of body, end quote. An article published on August 28th on the American fighting face, this was a really popular concept in Afloat and Ashore, embedded Hull's concepts about adolescent development alongside the idea that masculine countenances were self-made and transparently reflected the individual's efforts and success. So contrast this to Rockwell's cartoon Detention Days. The image directly mocked the naval promise to transform those boys coming from farms, schools, and offices into promising American men. In the central panel, ill-fitting uniforms highlight each figure's physical deficiencies. And perhaps the most surreptitious is a small transformative drawing at the bottom that shows the before face, weak-chinned, unsure, and gawkish, and the after face, full of manly mirth. So rather than inspiring, the dramatic transformation looks ridiculous and unachievable. Now, in comic strips, such ductile performers would usually be inscribed as identifiable types, in essence, a figure easily separated from their reading audience. But Rockwell frequently deliberately collapses the reader with the cartoon image. So see Flying Stevedore's Furlough, where the cartoon presents a mirror image to the naval reader of how you will look upon visiting home. Rather than the promised fighting face, the image highlights boyish hesitancy through pigeon-toed feet, lanky physique, and a disturbingly elongated giraffe-like neck. That circular head with those projecting ears, that borrowed from a familiar 19th century stock type meant to represent wayward children and juveniles, usually immigrants, but they also evoke the unflattering self-caricatures presented by college students in their humor magazines. So by the late teens, these collegiate self-portraits had grown more exaggerated and grotesque, gleefully presenting the college student as an American aberration. And Rockwell's images flaunted similar ineptitude and inadequacies. Furthermore, Flying Stevedore's Furlough did this only 2 weeks after Afloat and Ashore published a pretentious article claiming to diagnose America's national character by codifying the American fighting face. With an air of scientific accuracy, the article visually demonstrated how its archetypal face was assembled through a composite photograph based on 4 types of American fighters: the Marine, the Aviator, the Sailor, and the Yank. I know it's really hard to see in this copy from the microfilm, but we actually have this covered by Rockwell, which appears closely based on these anatomical models. So according to the article, the archetypal face presented, quote, a prominent brow with width between the eyes and width between the outer curve of each eye, end quote. So it was extremely specific about the anatomy. And this embodied the fighter's keen mental vision and well-developed organ of order. The author cites the face as the mirror of the mind and reads its features as fixed symbolism. Now, Flying Stevedore's Furlough not only presents the complete antithesis to the square-jawed masculine model, it also deliberately highlights the mutability of the naval face. A small inset cartoon contrasts the stalwart, determined in-camp mug to the garish, sleepy laughter of the going home face. And in this cartoon, the Army's rhythm of active duty and furloughs produces a cyclical, not linear timescale. Here, self-made manhood is not a stable Army product, but a metamorphic creature, able to relapse back into adolescent glee. The cartoon Navy seaman further discredited the assertion that the military face was fixed at all. And here, Rockwell is using another established comic device that became especially popular in college humor magazines, that how he thought he looked, how he really looked device. That's still popular today, actually. These cartoons drive their humor by exposing and mocking the subject's inflated self-perceptions. So a Navy seaman, the seaman's body vacillates between a bull-chested hero, a knob-nosed laggard, a bobble-headed adult, all depending on who encounters him. Only the Navy seaman's sweetheart and little brother equipped the heroic soldier with a broad chest and bold chin, here presented as immature and wishful fictions. To illustrate how the seaman really looks, Rockwell confronts the reader with a flat-footed, spaghetti-armed adolescent. The limp figure stands as inert material, brimming with plastic potential, yet disturbingly static. In how he sees himself, Rockwell presents the exact same figure, but animated, getting the girl and giving a jovial wink. This self-portrait and that visual camaraderie between winking image and knowing reader suggests that developing males did not buy the propaganda of the fighting face wholesale, nor necessarily saw themselves reflected in that model. Now, it's unlikely that Rockwell's images comprised a revolutionary overthrowing of ideals in this government-regulated publication, but they do suggest how humorous cartooning was accepted and integrated as providing relief from possible paradigms. And in fact, Rockwell often applied these same exaggerated cartooning techniques to his own autobiographical accounts. This happens verbally when he recounts buying a female corset in a desperate attempt to shape a masculine silhouette that had refused to develop naturally. It also happens visually, as seen in a series of private postcards. All the traveling companions have garish physiques, but Rockwell is especially distinguished by lanky height, tiny chest, and comparatively swollen abdomen. These self-narrations map doubt, insecurity, and conflict onto the wayward body as an inherently American experience. But because he pulls these exaggerations from traditions of cartooning, Rockwell also inscribed this experience with celebratory plasmatic potential that takes pleasure in overturning regulatory norms. So I wish to conclude here by reflecting on how this study might open broader interpretations of this more public cover art. Now take, for instance, Rockwell's inexplicably good-natured World War II soldier, Willie Gillis, who seems not only anachronistic, but downright ill-judged for the climate of 1941. Now, as a character, Willie's cartoon haplessness and adolescent naivete generates a sentimental protagonist. Yet, what if his cartooning guffaws are connected to the comic medium's association with modern onslaughts and anarchic resilience? And his explorations of adolescence are taken less literally and connected to its role as a fraught symbol of national strength. In other words, what if Willie is read not as a kid brother soldier, but as a personification of an unprepared America contemplating entering yet another world war? As a national personification, it presents a scathing satire of how America pictured itself as an allied power. And in this final image, painted just a month after the Pearl Harbor attacks, Rockwell bears that metaphor more bluntly and darkly, which may be the reason why it was never published. But it also helps illustrate my ultimate point here, and that's that Rockwell's work did not always operate as capitalist anesthesia. Rather, he often created these caustic visual interventions, creating easy illustrative sentiment by hybridizing it with plasmatic cartooning. And rather than eulogizing the American experience of growing up, he presents it as a visceral and carnal encounter. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to introduce Lyndon Hill, a third-year PhD candidate in Stanford's art history program, who passed her qualifying exam last week and is poised to embark on her dissertation project, a topic to be determined. Lyndon earned a BA from Barnard with majors in art history and dance, and an interdisciplinary senior thesis on the semiotics of mid-20th century leotards, on which she drew for an essay she published already in 2013. 2 years later, Lyndon received an MA from the Bard Graduate Center with a thesis on Yves Saint Laurent and Roland Petit's ballet Notre-Dame de Paris. Along the way, she has worked at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the Palais Galliera in Paris, and for American fashion designer Tom Brown, among others. This year, Lyndon is leading a Stanford Humanities Center workshop entitled Reframing Fashion Studies, Performance, Gender, and the Body. I'm pretty sure we will all find traces of these accomplishments and interests and much more coming together in Lyndon's paper on Pearl Primus's Dance Anthropology, 1943 to 1950. Thank you. Thank you, Lyndon.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd also like to thank everyone at the Getty who was involved in organizing this virtual symposium, and also to my colleagues and the faculty at Stanford, particularly Marcy Kwan and Nancy Troy, who have supported this research in various stages of its development. From Ted Shawn and Ruth St. Denis's explorations and exploitations of Native American and East Asian cultures, to the mythic abstractions of the so-called primitive dances of Martha Graham and Lester Horton, a proliferation of choreographers in the early 20th century turned to anthropological sources for inspiration, which were then transposed onto the American dance stage. One choreographer at the center of these investigations was Pearl Primus, a dancer and choreographer born in 1919 who earned a PhD in anthropology from New York University while pursuing a successful New York City-based performance career beginning in the early 1940s. Primus understood her anthropological and choreographic careers, which developed in tandem, as informing one another. Throughout her graduate studies, Primus took research-oriented fieldwork trips where she immersed herself in various cultures to better understand their movement practices, a methodology she called dance anthropology. Dance, in this case, served as both the subject matter of and as the means for communication in her research. Her newfound embodied knowledge subsequently informed her choreography, for which she adapted the movements she encountered in her fieldwork to create dances she performed at an array of theatrical and museum venues. As Primus's performances began receiving press coverage after her solo debut in 1943, a number of decisive epistemological questions and anxieties informed any analysis of her work. Her emergence onto the dance scene was concurrent with the development of a uniquely American modern dance idiom, and coincided with a moment when questions pertaining to the categories of American modernism, Black American modernism, American modern dance, and Black modern dance all stood at the forefront of artistic social consciousness. The dance field simultaneously tried to assess how to classify the proliferation of non-white performers and makers. Debates among cultural critics and members of the Black intelligentsia centered around whether Black dancers should home a separate genre of Black dance or should learn techniques associated with the larger category of American modern dance. Critics of her time, as well as contemporary dance historians, seem intent on rigidly categorizing Primus within one single framework. That is, Primus is typically only discussed within the context of Black modern dance. On the surface, this category might seem unproblematic. Primus was a Black woman who performed modern dance. Yet it remains nearly impossible to ascertain what Black modern dance actually signifies, choreographically or artistically. There seems to be little agreement among contemporary dance scholars as to whether Black modern dance refers to the identity of the choreographer, the identity of the performer, or the subject matter, music, or costuming of a given dance work. There is no academic monograph on Primus, but she is usually written about under the heading of Black modern dance alongside Katherine Dunham, another Black choreographer working at approximately the same period. Dunham and Primus, though both Black modern dancers interested in Afro-Caribbean anthropology, had vastly different artistic outputs, and I'm showing you a side-by-side of their different promotional materials. By boxing Primus and other dancers of her generation into this monolithic aesthetic category of Black modern dance, we risk losing sight of the nuance of her artistic practice. Taking a methodological cue from Darby English's How to See a Work of Art in Total Darkness, which proposes a rethinking of the category Black art in order to more closely analyze Black artists' multiple aesthetic intentions, my project is to consider how Primus may have orbited in, around, and through various categories of performance in the 1940s by analyzing her choreographic process and heterogeneous artistic output. Though she enjoyed a vibrant, almost 50-year career, both on stage and in academia, I focus on her early career, with particular attention paid to her two earliest ethnographic research trips, one to the American South in 1944, and the second to numerous countries in Africa between 1948 and 1950. I hope to highlight how, through her polyvalent influences and subsequent choreography, Primus acknowledged the frames audiences and critics placed upon her, while fundamentally resisting and exceeding them. Before delving any further, it's crucial to acknowledge that there is, as with any performance-related analysis, a pronounced lack at the center of this project. That is to say, there are very few extant recordings of Primus dancing the early works I'm concerned with, a lacuna that prohibits any deep choreographic analysis. However, I was able to consult more recent reconstructions of certain pieces to gain at least some sense of the type of movements at the core of Primus's work. Similarly, though there are numerous striking still photographs of Primus from this period, including a number by Carl van Vechten, two of which are shown here, many were taken outside of the performance space and offer very little contextual information, and I'm reluctant to draw broader claims about a performance solely from a still image. For this project then, I turn with a critical eye toward Primus's own published writing and to the journalists who regularly wrote about her choreography and anthropological ventures in publications including the New York Times, the Chicago Defender, Dance Magazine, Vogue, and the New York Amsterdam News. Pearl Primus was born in Trinidad in 1919, but her family relocated to New York City when she was a toddler. Although she took dance class recreationally while growing up, it wasn't until Primus had graduated from Hunter College on the pre-medicine track that dance became a central focus of her life. After finding a job in the wardrobe department of the New Dance Group, Primus eventually received a scholarship to study and ultimately perform with this collective. Founded in 1932, the New Dance Group was a radical left-wing dance organization and training school largely run by women. In addition to modern dance techniques, the curriculum included improvisation centered around social themes like we see pictured here, and lessons in Marxist theory. As a student with the New Dance Group, Primus trained with the Big Four of American modern dance: Martha Graham, Hanya Holm, Doris Humphrey, and Charles Weidman. She also learned Trinidadian dance from Beryl McBurney, one of the first Caribbean immigrants to promote Caribbean dance forms in New York. Her first 2 years of dance training, therefore, were deeply rooted in learning how to express contemporary socio-political issues through movement, which is an aesthetic strategy that would soon thereafter become a hallmark of Primus's independent career as an artist activist. 1943 was a turning point for Primus, the year that she began her solo performance career, coming to the immediate attention of dance and cultural critics alike. I should emphasize here the solo aspect of Primus's work. Whereas many of the performances by the New Dance Group and other major modern dance companies focused on powerful masses of female bodies overwhelming the stage, Primus used her singular Black body as a means of communication through movement. She did this at a time when both within and outside of the performance space, Black bodies were criminalized, mocked, and attacked. Performing her own choreography, however, Primus, as Black studies scholar Tammy Brown puts it, reclaimed and reframed the Black body as a thing of beauty and intelligence. She unified the aesthetic, cultural, and political into her single body, and in so doing, defied expectations for Black dance performance. As 1943 came to a close, John Martin, the dance critic of the New York Times and an early advocate for Primus, awarded her his debutante's crown for her sold-out performances. He commented, "There is no doubt that she is the most gifted artist dancer of her race yet to appear in the field, but it would be manifestly unfair to classify her merely as an outstanding Black dancer, for by any standard of comparison, she is an outstanding dancer without regard for race." As Martin's comment implies, his fellow dance critics felt compelled to indicate a separation between what they understood as Black and white artistry, which implies a separate standard for artists of different ethnicities. By and large, critics seem to have been unable to find language with which to discuss a Black woman dancing on stage. Rather than using their reviews as a space to meaningfully describe the dancing by speaking to the actual composition of the dance or specific artistic choices that the choreographer made, the questions that time and again are embedded in writing on Primus's work include, can a Black body be disciplined enough to possess dance technique and intentional expression? And what type of dancing should non-white dancers perform to overcome racial stereotypes? It is worth remarking that throughout her entire career, Primus self-identified as a modern dancer, and she often cited her training with the modern dance greats, noting in a 1979 interview, "My dances aren't all African and Caribbean inspired." Not only did audiences and critics alike not expect Black dancers like Primus to be well-versed in modern dance techniques, but they also balked at the possibility of a non-white dancer performing anything other than a more sexualized review of so-called primitive dance. One critic went so far as to claim that Primus could, quote, never be a great modern dancer because she will never be able to overcome her race, unquote. Beginning in her debut season, Primus presented repertoire that upended expectations placed upon her by virtue of her skin color alone. Her earliest residencies at Cafe Society, the first racially integrated club in New York and a leftist hangout, as well as at the Roxy Theater, involved programming that followed a similar pattern. She loosely grouped her dances into social protest dances, abstract modern dances, spirituals, and works based on African traditions, rhythms, and imagery, which would all be presented together in a single evening's performance. Primus's eclectic mixture of styles and influences reflects both her training and her self-fashioning as a multifaceted choreographer and performer. Her performance venues too reflect this heterogeneity, as she appeared at established venues for modern dance like the 92nd Street Y and Jacob's Pillow, but also toured a college circuit, performed at labor rallies, and gave lecture demonstrations at the American Museum of Natural History. Primus's most renowned social protest dance, which premiered in her debut season, titled Strange Fruit, consisted of a narrator reading the poem Strange Fruit aloud, while Primus took on the persona of a white woman at a lynching ground after the revelers had disappeared. The 5-minute piece involves the dancer traveling on a diagonal path, beginning in the upstage right corner as her body wavers between resisting and giving way to a seeming magnetic pull coming from the downstage left corner. The choreography features jarring transitions in which the dancer is upright, spinning, running, gaining momentum in her body until she suddenly and percussively drops to the ground to perform rhythmic floor work, gesticulating her limbs while lying prone on her back. One doesn't simply see the dancer's body, but one also hears it. 50 years after Strange Fruit's premiere, Primus stated, "I didn't create Strange Fruit for a dancer. I created it to make a statement within our society, within our world, and therefore it was made with my body. When I danced it, I wasn't a male or a female. I was a concept." Dance scholar Susan Manning explains that no photographs of Strange Fruit were published. Perhaps, she speculates, because the camera could not capture the power of Primus's weighted movement against the weighty text. Primus never further elaborated on the idea of performing as a concept rather than as a dancer, and it doesn't entirely square with her assertion from 1943 that she intended to embody a white woman. But we might speculate how it elucidates her stance toward the diversity within her own artistic output. Perhaps Primus meant to insinuate the possibility of evading classification of any concrete kind. Performing as a concept, Primus could remain unbounded. Other dances, such as African Ceremonial, which took its inspiration from a fertility rite in the Belgian Congo, veered less toward American socio-political concerns and more toward an attempt to combine her understanding of African dance forms with her modern dance training. Primus embarked on self-directed anthropological studies in order to inform her early choreography. In addition to being introduced to African sculpture at the New Dance Group, Primus studied African dance in books at the New York Public Library and consulted family and colleagues to learn Afro-Caribbean and West African dances. For these works, Primus included program notes to orient the viewer to the dance, and she often had a narrator sit at the side of the stage to explain to audiences what they were witnessing in between each piece. On performing these works, Primus noted at the time, "I do these dances to help white people to understand us, and also to help us understand ourselves, to help us drive out the feeling of inferiority that is nursed into us from the time we are born." Primus sought to dissociate notions of savagery from African dance forms, and seems to have been keenly aware of the presumptions her audiences, who were predominantly, though not exclusively white, may have brought to their viewing of her performances. Primus assuredly had a long-standing interest in anthropology and Afro-Caribbean history, but it wasn't until the summer of 1944 that she took her first fieldwork trip, for which she traveled to Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. While there, she posed as a migrant worker and a cotton picker. Her most informative research, though, occurred during her visits to no less than 67 Black churches, open-air revivals, and prayer meetings. As an outsider, Primus didn't dare to take notes. She instead participated in the services in order to both observe and mimic the movements of those around her. Primus's research methods were fully in the realm of participant observation, yet she approached this fieldwork from the perspective of not just a researcher, but also a dancer, which implies a breadth of embodied knowledge, as well as a unique ability to learn and absorb new types of movement. After these experiences in the South, Primus returned to New York and, without presenting a carbon copy of the movements she witnessed in the South, incorporated this information into her newest creations. That is to say, Primus did not perform pieces that involved acting out a church service on stage. Rather, one small movement she may have gleaned through her gestural research may have been abstracted into a different choreographic gesture. By 1945, Primus began working toward a PhD in anthropology at Columbia, where she studied with Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. She wouldn't complete her dissertation there. She took a circuitous route that culminated at NYU, where she received her degree in 1978, but one of her most ambitious fieldwork trips coincided with the Columbia years. At age 29, Primus received a grant from the Rosenwald Foundation to travel to Africa. Not only was this the largest Rosenwald grant awarded, but at $4,000, it was also the largest monetary prize. Her fieldwork involved an 18-month trip to study 30 cultural groups across Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, Cameroon, Liberia, and Senegal. Primus hoped both to perpetuate her idea of dance anthropology and to learn about the movement practices of various people in order to, in her own words, gain the facts about which I danced, the facts, and not just the feelings. While in Africa, Primus participated in dances of welcome, peace, birth, marriage, and death. It should come as no surprise that in addition to taking photographs and film footage, Primus participated in learning many of the dances. Meanwhile, she maintained in contact with New York-based dance writers and editors at Vogue, who published her fieldwork notes and photographs in their publications. I'm showing just one example here from Theater Arts magazine. Primus seems to have been self-aware that she was engaging in practices that were not likely to have been acceptable in a strictly anthropological setting. She said, "When these people truly dance, there can be no observers. The observers are snatched, plucked up by an invisible force and hurled into the ring of the dance, their own heartbeat matching the crescendo of pulsing sound, their bodies becoming one with the sweating dancers." As in her earlier fieldwork, Primus learned movements through body-to-body transmission, rather than maintaining the distance expected of an anthropologist. Doris Herring, one of the journalists with whom Primus corresponded while she was abroad, explained, "They taught Primus their own dances in a way that would be the envy of any dancing school right here in our own country. If she had difficulty ascertaining exactly which muscles to move, a native dancer would hold his or her body against her own so she could literally absorb the movement." After learning the dances, Primus had a number of methods for recording her findings. She employed the terminologies of ballet, modern dance, anatomy, and kinesiology to describe the dances, drew line sketches to illustrate postures, and used poetic meter to indicate rhythms. As Primus describes it, her largest conclusion from her first Africa trip was that for many of the cultural groups she observed, dance and life were inextricable. She writes, "I knew then that I had not gone to Africa to study something, for I had become a part of that something." Primus's first trip to Africa left a long-lasting impact on her artistic and personal life. In addition to devoting a large part of the remainder of her career to continuing fieldwork in Africa, she opened a dance center in Liberia that was dedicated to the preservation of African ceremonial dances, and her artistic output after 1950 certainly shifted to focus a bit more on African dance. Perhaps most poignantly, in all future performances, Primus insisted on being listed in her programs with 3 additional names in 3 different Nigerian languages, which translate to child returned home, daughter of all, and one born into darkness faces the light. As critics and thinkers around her continued to attempt to categorize Primus as either an ethnic dancer, a modern dancer, a Black American, or a Caribbean immigrant, she took it upon herself to give herself not one name, but 3, as she persisted in creating works that both incorporated movement idioms she had studied in Africa and drew from her other dance training experiences. With a bodily archive consisting of an amalgam of influences, both ethnographic and choreographic, Pearl Primus's dance works resist rigid categorization. Through her dance and academic work alike, she facilitated a dialogue between modern dance, Black vernacular dance, and African ceremonial dance without ever settling into any single category that critics may have tried to ascribe to her. Nearly a century after Primus began dancing, the question of what constitutes Black modern dance remains at the forefront of dance scholarship. Dance critic Zita Allen puts it best when she writes, "Is Black dance just an empty label that was devised by white critics to cover that vast, richly diverse, and extremely complex area of dance they know all too little about? Does Black dance really exist?" As Allen insinuates, perhaps dance scholars need to consider how the category of Black modern dance is stymieing a comprehensive understanding of Primus's body of work. Primus's project certainly contains irresolvable inconsistencies which may be difficult to define within certain aesthetic categories, yet this is no reason to circumvent a more detailed analysis of her work. The textured heterogeneity of Primus's oeuvre, from her collaboration with John Cage to her dance anthropology and her lectures at the Museum of Modern Art, requires nuanced critical attention. And I want to be clear that I'm not proposing that we ignore Primus's Blackness. However, rather than veiling Primus works under the vague category of Black modern dance, we could shift our attention to both Primus's creative process and the works themselves in order to more pointedly ground her in the history of modern dance. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson, and I'm thrilled to introduce the last speaker of this already invigorating day, Lesdi Goussen Robleto. Lesdi received her BA from New York University and is currently a PhD candidate in the History of Art department at UC Berkeley, where she is pursuing advanced research into gender, race, sexuality, and revolution in the context of Central American and Caribbean art. Her dissertation in progress, Unmending Bodies, Patricia Belli and Feminist Artistic Praxis in Central America, will be the first major scholarly examination of Patricia Belli, an important Nicaraguan artist who emerged in the 1980s and whose work spans textiles and radical pedagogical experiments. In 2019, Lesdi was on the curatorial team for the much lauded exhibition About Things Loved, Blackness and Belonging at the Berkeley Art Museum. Her presentation today is on the Cuban-born artist Zilia Sánchez, and it's drawn from her master's thesis, a thesis that I had the honor and pleasure of advising. Please join me in welcoming Lesdi.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction, and to the Getty for hosting this event, and to all of my colleagues at UC Berkeley who helped me prepare for this talk. I want to begin with a 2013 interview filmed with Artist Space, where Zilia Sánchez narrates the trajectory of her artistic career from her home in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Throughout this interview, she gestures with her hands to move beyond the limitations of language, which with each question presented, she further pronounces the gesticulations of her body to capture the undulations of her erotic topologies, a term she coined in the 1960s to describe the bulging curvature of her fleshy compositions. Turning to broken English to touch on her relationship to minimalism, she cheekily states, "I read about minimalism, the text, and it said, no color, no touch, only construction. But I touch too much, and I like titles. No color, only dark, white, a little pink, but I am minimal." She stops to linger in Spanglish for a moment and continues, "Cómo se puede decir como una mezcla, mulatica?" She pauses for one more moment and goes on to say, "Mulatto, do you know what a mulatto is? I'm a mulatica minimal, you understand?" With no response, the scene is cut and the interview continues, leaving her postulation of an evocation of mulataje unaddressed and unresolved. Evoked throughout the span of her career, the term mulata minimalist has been repeatedly presented in scholarship on her work without any critical engagement. More recently, in her retrospective exhibition, Soy Isla, the term surfaces again, this time with partial acknowledgement in the exhibition catalog. While I'm indebted to the recent scholarship that has been produced on her work, particularly through this exhibition, I can't help but linger on mulataje and its many inflections. Thinking through the implications of this term, this talk lingers on questions of mulataje and minimalism. In doing so, I'm interested in how Sánchez's outsider status, inflected by her nationality, gender, and queer identity, initiates a dialogue around mulataje that draws on Caribbean repertoires that provide us with alternative epistemologies with which to conceptualize her hybrid minimalist practice. Without losing sight of her whiteness in this discourse, I engage the themes and fluid choreographies that her works enact to consider how her practice is driven by liminal sensibilities that reach beyond the archive. Looking to works like Soy Isla, which literally translates to I am an island, I consider how her fluid identifications interpolate mulata minimalism, and how mulataje as a hybrid grammar serves to disrupt minimalism's aesthetics by drawing on embodied repertoires that take shape through the crossfires between colonial terminologies, post-colonial identity formations, and decolonial knowledges. Before I can tend to this dialogic arc, I turn to the construction of mulataje more broadly, to ensure that when we speak of these terms, we do so explicitly. Historically, mulataje emerges in the Western Hemisphere as a socially constructed racial category that indexes the mixture of European and African descendants. Within the discourse of mulataje, the mulata comes to the fore as a liminal figure that oscillates between racial markers, who is acutely exoticized and explicitly gendered in the colonial imaginary, carrying with her connotations of hypersexuality and social palatability. In the case of Cuba, the mulata emerges as a national symbol and emblem of Cuban culture, appearing as an icon of dance and across major exports like rum. In Mulata Nation, Visualizing Race and Gender in Cuba, art historian Alison Frauner works to recuperate the performative potential of mulata subjectivity, bringing our attention to the ways in which mulataje produces slippages to colonial binaries. Through Homi Bhabha's work on mimicry, Fauner reminds us that Mulata has the potential to encroach on dominant social orders through a range of subversive strategies. As we consider these subversions, we must not lose sight of the fact that discourses of Mulata have been wielded to ameliorate colonial violence, used as a socially constructed tool with which to uphold whiteness, perpetuate colorism, and disguise anti-Blackness, both in Latin America and the Caribbean. Arriving in New York in 1960, Sanchez's encounter with minimalism is undergirded by the incommensurable space between New York and Cuba, and by the conditions of what it means to work across cultural and aesthetic lines of separation. As an outsider to minimalism's discourses, she comes to develop a rather eccentric understanding of minimalist practices, which only gets further distorted once she moves to Puerto Rico in 1970. While I aim to tend to minimalisms in the longer form of this paper, and I address it as a plural conceit, I want to situate her practice using her own terms. As we might recall from her interview, she posits an understanding of minimalism that is described around limitations and restrictive movements that don't accommodate the intimacy of titles or touch. Countering these categorical dispositions, which are delineated by a series of key features that appear across the ranging practices of self-identified and primarily male artists, she forges a space alongside minimalism to accommodate her all too fleshy, bulging compositions and multiple desires. We see this come through in works like Troyana from 1967, where the composition looks like, but is not quite aligned with minimalism's tenets. Breaking with the limitations of surface constraints and static arrangements, she allows the compositions to take on a life of their own through infinite iterations and possible arrangements. Encroaching on minimalism's polemics, her work stands somewhere between painting and sculpture, or objects and bodies, always confronting and confounding the viewer's perceptions. In works like Subliminal from 1972, the composition protrudes into the viewer's space, inciting a spectrum of visceral reactions that shift with one's orientations. While it could be said that her works come into dialogue with post-minimalism and performance practices in the United States, what I aim to propose is that these tendencies reach beyond these lineages and towards other aesthetic sensibilities that fall outside of the Western canon by being rooted in questions of being and interdependency. Situating her erotic topologies through the discourse of Mulata as an index of mixing, I'm interested in how her aesthetic inclinations, accentuated by her queer identity, speak to an ambivalent politic of in-betweenness that draws openly on minimalism's tenets, as well as other sources of influence that emerge from embodied inflections. To assist my thinking, I turn to queer theorist José Estaban Munoz, who reframes hybridity to move us away from colonial binaries. Writing about lesbian identity at the nexus of American and Cuban culture, Munoz reconceptualizes hybridity as a crossfire of influences, affiliations, and politics, reminding us that hybridity works in an expanded field, constituted by multiple crossfires. Working out of this queer lens, I center on this definition to bridge a connection between mulataje and hybridity that extends beyond the violent limitations of colonial definitions. Thinking through this lens, I'm interested in how Sanchez's deployment of mulataje appears to speak to a different, perhaps more subversive and hybrid sensibility that tends to the liminal markers of her identity, and more generally, to liminal embodiments and worldviews. Pushing against the notion of duality and perfect symmetries in her works, Sánchez privileges irregularities that make room for the undisciplined and the unruly. This is perhaps best captured through the subtle asymmetries that emerge throughout her compositions, seen in works like Lunar V, where two irregular halves come together in a disjointed embrace. These asymmetries are further underscored by the fact that her works are made by hand, implicating her body in the process of stretching canvas over the wooden armatures that she has prepared to achieve relief. The somatic thread is continued by how she conceptualizes the materiality of canvas, which she refers to as skin, and the armature, which she views as the most vulnerable part of the composition, again, bringing our attention to the precarity of structures, both in systems and in bodies. Through single panel compositions, Sanchez's works come together as imperfectly joined totalities. In works such as El Silencio de Eros from 1980 and Lunar from 1985, embodied asymmetries manifest through the joining of two paralleling forms that are placed alongside each other in terms that are reminiscent of bodily parts. Coming together like lips or jointed bones, her works create intimate proximities that are inflected by titillating clefts of liminal space. Working through this corporeal grammar, her erotic topologies remind us of the ways that the body itself is never determinate or quite in place, pushing us to think of bodies in more expansive ways, to include all those bodies beyond conditioned humanism, such as an island or the moon. To elaborate on this notion, I turn onto a drawing in her Significado del Significante series from the 1960s, where the artist explores the contingency of forms by disrupting the ontology of a signifier-signified paradigm. Referencing one of the circular forms, Sánchez states, "This is an egg, it's the world, and it's a breast." Speaking to a feminist and queer framework that refutes normative and fixed categories, Sánchez provides us with a revised proposition that pushes the boundaries of Western ontological thought and matters of being. In her conception, the work is an index of indiscriminate pluralities, a testament to the ways in which a single signifier can accommodate multiple significations. Her formulation also evokes a decolonial sensibility that reorganizes the body, returning us to the idea that she herself is an island. Through these associative meanings, her works bring to mind the quasi-corporeal affects of Ferreira Goulard's notion of the non-object, forming part of a larger pan-Latin American aesthetic discourse that deterritorializes minimalism systemization by privileging the body as a site of signification. Registering the dynamic movements of these ontological disruptions, we find that her erotic topologies mirror a similar dynamicism that emerges through the work's internal construction. In works like Maquetas o Isla, gestural dialogues are enacted by the fleshy physicality of her bulging reliefs, precipitating a sense of movement and touch. Much like dance, her works underscore the intimacy and eroticism of bodily encounters. These rhythmic allusions are further underscored by the oblique color blocks that frame each relief, introducing an element of oppositional movement. In Soy Isla, her deployment of rippling lines trace compositional choreographies that remind us of the ways bodies dance in space, or perhaps how bodies of water and the cosmos are in constant movement, tracing similar paths. Sanchez's spatial choreographies culminate with her move to Puerto Rico in 1970, moving her further away from minimalism's aesthetics by returning her to the undulations of the archipelagic landscape and the warmth of the familiar Caribbean waters. As she tells us, going to the blue sky and the ocean of Puerto Rico was almost like going home. Besides, the landscape is the same and the people are similar. We are built from the same mold. Speaking to this return, her work Lunar con Tatuaje, which she initiated in 1968 and worked on for almost 30 years, emerges as an effective cartography that is literally marked by the liminal space of being almost, but not quite, home. Populated by muddled lines or tattoos, as Sánchez calls them, the composition evokes a vocabulary of memories and associations that dance across the surface. In drawing these tattoos, she reaches for alternative visualities by describing how she closes her eyes to see better, allowing line to come through as an embodied inscription. In its disorientations, the composition speaks to the fluidity of memory and the hybrid choreographies that are produced by the conditions of migration and exile, charting the artist's movements as she's pulled back to a more familiar place. In my much earlier work titled Lo que es de isla y piel, or That Which Belongs to Island and Skin from 1958, Sánchez speaks to the sensibility of belonging, which we see come up throughout her practice. As a proposition, that which belongs to island and skin comes into dialogue with Diana Taylor's formulation of the repertoire, which accounts for embodied and ephemeral forms of knowledge that are fluid and transferable. Foreshadowing the tattoos that she would continue to draw on her bulging canvases, this and other works from her Afro-Cubano series speak to the ways in which Caribbean repertoires are culturally transmitted and inscribe themselves onto the body and onto skin. These connections are further articulated through a series of archival images that show her works alongside the ocean, moving us beyond the gallery space to remind us that they too belong to this place. Like her tattoos, these embodiments also surface through her use of color. Narrating this experience, she notes, colors have to call to me. Sometimes I listen to the call and I grab my brush and start painting over works that are already done. By simply looking to the overwhelming muted colors that come to dominate her compositions, we can acknowledge that her use of color comes into dialogue with discourses of minimalism and racial politics in Cuba. However, there is something to be said about color as an embodied calling. Complicating our reading of whiteness or whitewashed palatabilities, I want to call attention to the symbolism of white and African diasporic spiritualities. Opposite to the notion of objectivity, which we see in minimalism and colonial constructions, white symbolizes ancestral lineages and notions of balance and coolness, bringing us back to the idea of a calling. Building on this connection, we also find that her erotic typologies gesture to Cuban modernist practices that draw on African diasporic visualities. As she has previously noted, her work is influenced by artists like Wilfredo Lam, who directly engaged with Santeria's hybrid aesthetics, namely through allusions to ritualistic symbologies and morphological forms. Looking across their works, we find visual resonances through the treatment of line, and later through the compositional organicism that emerges in her erotic typologies, which come to resemble biomorphic forms similar to Lam's. In gesturing to these influences, I advocate for a disorientation of our own desires to make these symbols more legible. Instead, I ask that we simply notice that these visual symmetries are there, forming part of a repertoire. I do this as a gesture to maintain the opacity of these practices, and as a praxis of knowledge production that respects its limits. After all, contrary to what the archive might tell us, these influences are always already there, bridging connections that strategically elide legibility. Returning to the idea of dance, evoked loosely throughout this talk, I want to explore how Sanchez's erotic typologies register bodily formations and compositional choreographies that are rooted in Cuban cultural forms that form part of Caribbean repertoires. While Sánchez does not speak of this theme, we know from the archives that she was interested in exploring the relationship between music and movement in her compositions. More explicitly, dance and popular music allow us to engage more directly with mulataje as it relates to constructions of cubanidad. Writing about mulata embodiment in She is Cuba, performance theorist Melissa Blanco Borelli explores how the mulata has been historically and culturally relegated to the field of seduction, coded by her voluptuous body and sensual movements. Through the analytic of hypnosis, she works to recuperate acts of pleasure and resistance that are enacted by mulata embodiments in Cuban popular dances, such as the rumba, which are typically danced by a heteronormative pairing. Similar to the rumba, Sanchez's titillating encounters evoke a repertoire of familiar forms and movements that are deeply ingrained in the Cuban imaginary as constitutive of mulata subjectivity. As Blanco Borelli writes, despite these constructions, hypnosis allows us to see how the mulata utilizes her body and gaze to take control of the dance by mediating the erotic encounter between her and her opportunist male partner. Speaking to a similar maneuver, Sánchez describes how her compositions dominate the spectator by giving the sense that they are looking back at us. By returning the gaze, her works not only reclaim space, but they also confront the heteronormative spectatorship that conditions our ways of looking, specifically the ways we look at objects and read race, gender, sexuality, and bodies. It is through these histories of mulataje and their centrality in constructions of cubanidad that we must also return the gaze to Sánchez herself and question the ways in which colonial terminologies continue to perpetuate violence through the utterances afforded to white and brown bodies, precisely because of cultural repertoires and notions of national belonging. After all, it is Blackness that has been historically obscured and refuted through the very construction of mulataje, making it possible for the term to be ignored, normalized, or unconsciously claimed. While I have attempted to reformulate mulataje by thinking through hybrid grammars and liminal sensibilities in Sanchez's practice, the violent inheritances of this term is something we must acknowledge, contend with, and ultimately undo. To close, I turn to the only performance piece in Sanchez's career, a work titled Encuentrísimo, Ofrenda o Retorno, where the artist is shown throwing one of her erotic topologies, Soy Isla, into the break of the waves. Performed on the shores of a beach in San Juan, the composition dances in the water, pulled away by the spume of the tides only to be returned again by the crashing waves. With each return, Sánchez gently grabs the composition and casts it back out, as if offering it up to the water, bringing to mind allusions to the Santeria Orisha Yemaya, who resides over the ocean. Through the turbulence of the clear blue water, we are reminded of the many bodies that have passed through it, from slavery, migration, and exile, returning us to a repertoire that is rooted in this place and in these waters. Alluding to reunion, the interconnectivity of all bodies, Encuentrísimo speaks of encounter, of a new kind of universalism that is fluid and expansive. It speaks of the fluid dance that moves us beyond aesthetic constraints, and of the unmooring forces that break beyond structures and return us to the body, to the cosmos, and to the water. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, Linden, and Lesdi, for 3 really rich and thought-provoking papers. I'd like to invite you all back to the screen now, along with Nancy Troy, who will be moderating our discussion. Our moderator, Nancy J. Troy, has been the Victoria and Roger Sant Professor in Art at Stanford University since 2010. For the previous 16 years, she taught at the University of Southern California. The Getty has supported her work through 2 GRI visiting fellowships in 1989 and again in 2008, and as editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin for 3 years in the mid-1990s. Nancy is the author of 4 monographs: The de Stijl Environment, Modernism and the Decorative Arts in France, Couture Culture, and the Afterlife of Piet Mondrian. She is now completing a book that brings together Mondrian, Yves Saint Laurent, and pop art in America during the 1960s. Welcome.
What a rich, offering from the 3 of you. In certain ways, from all modern art, or an array from modern to contemporary, and so sharing certain period things, but nevertheless in a kind of sequence from the early 20th century to the present. And I think also remarkably in terms of the very different kinds of artists you're looking at, let's say genres, although Lesdi and Linden, we're both talking about dance to a greater degree than we might have thought would be happening at the beginning of Lesdi's talk. I think there are, important overlaps that unite the ways in which you think about works of art and of performance. And I think it's important to think about this because I don't know that the same kinds of perspectives would necessarily have been emphasized in another context or at another time. So I want to point out some of these, and then I want to invite you to think about how what I'm seeing as a set of core interests across these rather different papers might speak to the moment in which you're writing, both the constraints and the opportunities on your research, and perhaps other things. But I think you have perspectives about why these are the topics. And I would say that, for example, we can see that even in a paper on Norman Rockwell, race is a very important subject, and one that perhaps isn't emphasized in the same way as in these other papers, but in any event, I think it's a certain kind of set of assumptions about Rockwell, even if not all the types that he was investigating. But I think his college, the people he's looking at are all white males, if I read the imagery correctly. So that that's an assumption and also something that, structures how you think, I think, about the topic. But class is also something that several of you talked about, and underlying all of your talks is the body and the way in which it is articulated. And I think it's really interesting to question how, for example, the identity and the identity of your artists and their relationship to thinking through the body is either similar, different, or how that might work. So I think we have race, class, gender, and the body. And we also have a couple of other things which may not be as universal, but one is the notion, let's say, of either the United States or North America and other spaces where these artists are defining themselves in relation to either crossing borders or thinking about how they define who they are. And I also felt that these kinds of things, how you each think the challenge that you want to address as scholars, taking on these subjects, the topics that you've chosen, what it is about those topics, if you have any thoughts you could share, why it is that is the way you're talking about these objects. It's not about, for example, some other way in which may have been talked about or not enough talked about by other scholars heretofore, because I think these are things that actually identify you as young scholars entering the field now. And I think that's important for all of us to acknowledge that you're really shaping the kinds of questions that get asked, and perhaps even, so Norman Rockwell is not a figure nobody heard of, but some of the other two, perhaps yes, or perhaps no. Maybe it's, only my own unfamiliarity, for example, that I didn't know about Sanchez's work and so on. So I wonder if any of these issues or questions are something that you could speak to and possibly also speak across to one another in thinking about that. And hopefully we'll do that not as long-winded as I have been, perhaps, so that we can also entertain some questions from the audience after you address this, if you wish to do so. Thank you. Should I put one of you on the spot? So,
I can jump in. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of those questions and for situating all of the themes that emerged across all of the works that we saw today. I think for me, doing work on Sánchez has been really motivated by questions of citational practice, right? Thinking about what is the Western canon and how the Western canon is shaping itself. How is that then being further inflected by global art histories? And who are we citing? And what happens when we need to think about practices that fall beyond the archive, right? And are speaking to sensibilities that are perhaps rooted in much more decolonial ways of thinking, right? That are challenging colonial construction. So that's been the challenge and that's been the work of this paper. And also, I think more generally with Sánchez specifically, the inheritances that she's carrying specifically with this term mulataje and claiming an identification that now in the field of Latin American art history and Latinx studies at large is being really contested because of questions of whiteness, right? So thinking about how can we complicate our reading of mulataje, hold ourselves accountable to these colonial legacies, hold room for subversion, but still make sure that we're tending to the intricacies and the violences that these terms kind of carry with them in decentering Blackness, right? So I think a lot of the questions that I'm thinking about do have to do with these global discourses of race, and they're also field specific, and we're starting to see them be more field specific, especially within Latin American discourses.
So thank you, Lesdi. Some of what you said, I think, resonates perhaps with some of the points Linden was taking on at the beginning of her paper about these epistemologies and what we're doing when we describe and what the artist thought of the kinds of categories that were available to her then. So I wonder if you have any kind of comment to build on that, and then we'll turn to Christine. Linden first.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Nancy. I think I would first just say that I came to Primus as a subject through my own dance history training. She is a name that certainly does emerge, but as I mentioned, it was just stuck into a portion of one lecture on Black modern dance that puts Primus in conversation with Katherine Dunham and Alvin Ailey and maybe Bill T. Jones, depending on how contemporary we're getting. And I just felt that the category was kind of defining Primus rather than her own work, her own aesthetic projects, her interests. I had very little sense of what she was actually after in her own work, which is why I wanted to kind of dig in and figure out what she was doing. And you raised some questions about identity and categories, and Primus really is a tricky subject. Reading her writing over time, she changes her mind a lot, and she goes back and kind of revises her thoughts on some of her early works. And the biggest example of this that comes up for me is her use of the word primitive. And early on in her career in the 40s, she would describe her works that were based on African ceremonial dances as primitive dances. And in fact, after her first fieldwork trip to Africa, she came back to New York and opened up a school that was called Pearl Primus's School of Primal Dance. But a few decades later, she writes that she decided that she didn't want to use that term anymore, so she stopped referring to her dances in that way. She doesn't elaborate on it, but it certainly, it is difficult as the researcher to figure out what to do with these kind of conflicts and how to reconcile them within my own work.
Thank you. So, Christine, from your perspective or the perspective of your research, I wonder if you can help us navigate some of these kind of issues and how you think perhaps you engage with them perhaps differently than Cecile might have done, or others in, others who deal perhaps with caricature. Mm-hmm. And the kinds of issues you're looking at, and what Rockwell does to kind of challenge even what became seemingly, his imagery in his painting. Anyway, it's really interesting to see this earlier work.
Thank you so much for your comments, Nancy. I loved how you talked about the similarities between them, and I've been trying to think of why is this happening at this cultural moment? I mean, I know for me, these ideas of questioning categories are coming from the people I'm reading, like Cecile's work and everybody who came before me. So it feels like it's definitely coming to the fore right now, but it's definitely something I know, I'm trying to incorporate and learn from other scholars. From my perspective, I mean, a lot of what I'm looking at with Rockwell is trying to see how this category of whiteness wasn't bought by everybody, and it wasn't believed in by everybody. In fact, very few people fit it, and that cartooning and comics was a place where they could explore these kind of misfit conceptions, and people could come together and form communities around them. For me, the bigger categorical challenge is how to even talk about a work like Rockwell or works like cartooning and comics. And there's so many scholars that have come before me for the past few decades that are trying to just wedge in a place for comics to be talked about as a visual medium. Because I found with Rockwell, I think the difficulty is we tend to, well, not we, but I think the art historical perspective is to identify rebellion by seeing if it matches what's going in the fine arts of painting and gallery work in the avant-garde. But if you look at the language that like magazine illustrators have to use, those who draw comics have to use, you can see rebellion happening in them, although it doesn't fit the categories that exist. So that's where I feel like I'm really trying to contend with categories. Like, how can you seek how these artists are making alternative conversations, even though they don't fit essentially the kind of language we've developed to identify that in art historical works.
Well, for one thing, just one sort of detail comes to mind. It's very apt that you're thinking about those kind of issues at the Getty. Jim Cuno, who is the president, I think, or the CEO, I'm not sure what his title is, but he heads up the Getty Trust. He actually wrote his dissertation, I think, on caricature in the 19th century in France. And so, under different conditions and so on, but some of the same kinds of issues of type versus how it diverges from type, which is what makes those kinds of drawings, I think, so legible. And it's amazing that you have them on one page. What I thought of when there's an image that you show of a figure who is, I think, lying down or standing up. I mean, it kind of happens over time. He's changing so that seemed also kind of incipiently performative. And it was interesting. Also, Lesdi, you have these works that are not necessarily, happening in time, but they create, I take it, the space of performance. And because they are so insistently invoking the body and the skin and the, bodily, almost like there are no fluids in them, but you think something's gonna, come out of these works or something like this. In any event, it's just interesting to see that each of you in your work has to take on or is motivated to take on these issues around performance, which I think well, especially Linden, you were pointing out, there is no way to really, even a film presumably would not capture a performance or a video entirely. So the archive that you have encourages each of you, I think, to not exactly project, but to, invest in what you're seeing in a way that allows you to think through the bodily performance and what's happening to the bodies that are there, even if it is bodies of kind of sculptural pictures, in ways that I think are really interesting and quite contemporary. I want to encourage anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question. We have one here. So I'm not positive if I'm supposed to give the floor. I think maybe I'm going to read this, and if the Getty wants me to call on the person, next time I'll do that. But Amy Ogata from USC has a question for Christine. Christine, how might the Rockwell imagery via comics be situated between other popular caricatures of children, such as Little Lord Fauntleroy of about 1900, and the post-war rebellious teenager that proliferated in print culture?
That's a great question and a long answer. So I'll try to give a very quick answer to it. So Little Lord Fauntleroy, that's a fantastic resource. He kind of, by 1900, he's starting to become outdated. So I know Rockwell with his stringy Adolescent is sort of playing on that, but I feel like it's really artists like R.F. Occult with Buster Brown comics that have sort of destroyed that as a model that anybody really puts any, really abides by. For the rebellious teenager, that's actually part of my dissertation, and I'm looking at Norman Rockwell's covers in the 1920s that focus on his model, Frank Lischke, who is this very, very kind of young, very, very stringy adolescent. What I would say is that was kind of a sex symbol in the 1920s to have this sort of young college grad who was very skinny. It was embodying his youthfulness. But what Rockwell will do is make him very gawky, very awkward. He always tries to romance a girl and he messes it up. So Rockwell always has this way of taking what's the most fashionable, desirable thing and showing someone trying to do it and just absolutely flopping, like not able to achieve it at all.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. The Twiggy of the early 20th century and whether it's sexualized or made awkward. I think that question comes back in the 1960s in the female form in that case. So we have another question here from Jennifer Gonzalez, who, yes, here it is. Thank you all for your excellent talks. I would like to ask Robleto whether she would care to elaborate on the relationship of Sanchez's work to formal, if not conceptual precedents or peers, such as Lucio Fontana or Lee Bonteque.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, I mean, I think Sánchez is definitely looking to a lot of interlocutors. And in the scholarship on her work, many of these interlocutors are actually coming from a European canon. She's thinking about art informel in her earlier styles, right? And then when she comes into contact with minimalism, is thinking about minimalism. But it is interesting to know that, as I stated, her conception of her practice is very eccentric, so much so that she comes to cite folks like Louise Nevelson, who was not formally considered a minimalist per se, as the interlocutor for minimalism. So there's a way in which she's looking to European practices, especially during her time in Cuba. She has a lot of friends that run in circles, especially after the revolution and once they all exile, that are thinking through European and American canons, and we see that come through. But her formal understanding of minimalism comes to be articulated through Louise Nevelson. And then, of course, what I'm trying to argue through these other embodied repertoires that, that are inscribed onto her from her upbringing in Cuba and from just being part of cultural circuits that are outside of the European canon.
So thank you. I actually, I think that's, really interesting that she doesn't identify necessarily as a feminist, but she wants to kind of make the claim to minimalism and but the artists who you did, I think, reference were all female, if I'm remembering correctly. But I want to turn actually for a moment to Linden, and I wanted to ask you to comment on, you showed two photographs side by side of your artist, sorry, I'm losing myself here, of Primus, sorry, with two sculptures. And what you make of her encounter with those things. Is it an encounter? Did she, was she given those to pose with? Or did she own them? Had she brought them back from somewhere? What, do you know anything about those? Or what, how would you, posit what's going on in those images? Or another way to answer that question might be simply to say, I showed that because. So what did it mean to you to be showing that if you don't actually know what they were or have a kind of definitive answer to what was going on in those portraits?
Yes, Nancy, thank you for that question. And I wish I knew something about these photographs. There are probably a dozen or so photographs that were taken, I believe, in the same sitting with Carl van Vechten. There were a variety of different backdrops that were used. The two that I showed, or maybe some kind of maybe an African type print, I'm not sure. And others had a more floral backdrop. Some of them, she's just posing and smiling at the camera. And in the two that I showed, she's holding these sculptures, and I really know nothing about them. And I haven't found anything yet that's written about kind of what was going on in the studio at those moments. They were taken quite early in her career in 1943, but she did ultimately end up focusing her dissertation, which she completed in 1978, on African sculpture. So it's a kind of interesting foreshadowing moment. So, I think that it would be possible. Something that came up earlier in the discussion was about, kind of the lack that exists in archives, particularly when we're talking about performances. And I think another way that I could could have approached this topic would be to start with these images and kind of acknowledge that, I don't know anything definite about them, but approaching it with a kind of curiosity and speculation, and that could just open an avenue to just a different type of encounter with Primus's work.
So Christine, maybe you could talk a little bit about your archive, which I take it was these publications primarily. And so I'm trying to think about each of you, what your investment is in animating and making articulate the material that you have. And some of that, when you don't have letters or, you can't identify what the thing is, you have this, in your case, you do have, I think, very articulate sort of cartoons where there are words identifying the images. So I'm just wondering, when you encountered that, was that early on in your research? That was the first thing you saw? Or you were already interested in cartoon and so forth? Just wondering, because I think in order to really make it work, you have to do things with it, which I think you're all doing that. How you approach the visual object and invest it with the kinds of questions and meanings, I would say, constructing the problems you want to address.
I love these bigger questions. So for the Norman Rockwell research, is originally focused on his images for the country gentleman of this really like hopeless lanky city boy called Cousin Reginald. And it was really about going to focus on Rockwell just kind of castigating this hopeless adolescent over and over again. So I was very excited when I found Afloat in a Shores fairly early in the process, where it was a little bit more evident that he was kind of playing with this model and not just castigating like these hopeless adolescents, but actually making images that figures would relate to. I think my archival challenge is that the comics seem to be saying something sometimes very condemning and very rebellious, but they were entertaining, they were very much accepted, widely circulated, and the artists don't ever comment about their own rebelliousness. So that's why I love listening to Lesdi's and Linden's presentation and getting these ideas of how the artists are talking about how they're trying to break categories, even if it's just very, very implied. Rockwell, Rockwell was conscripted by Saturday Evening Post really to come off as a very specific persona. So he doesn't say anything really publicly about his work having any sort of like rebellious streak, and neither does R.F. Accold. Although if you read his comics, it's obviously sometimes like he's doing these really scathing political critiques and you can't avoid it, but it's not commented on anywhere. So for me, the archival challenge is trying to get the images to talk when the literature around there talking about the images saying how they're just entertainment and it's fluff and we shouldn't take them too seriously, whereas I feel like the images are saying the opposite.
Well, that's quite interesting given what was said about his paintings after that, I take it. But we have another set of questions here from the audience. This is Robert Gordon Fogelson, who writes, I'm wondering if you all, but perhaps especially Christine and Linden, might speak to the way that clothing conditions how we perceive the bodies and or identities that you are examining here. Lesdi, do you? Well, all three of you, actually. It's actually the clothing is really that of the works that you're looking at. So anyway, Christine and Linden in particular, but I had actually asked the same kind of question of Linden, a related one, I guess. Is it significant what she's wearing, and when is it significant? Maybe you could just speak a little bit to what she's wearing. Most of them look very deliberately kind of evoking certain kinds of ethnic costume. Is that correct?
In some cases. I admittedly don't know a ton about Primus's costuming choices. I know for many of her early works, she seemed to wear like 3/4 length dresses that were about knee length. And she often wore her hair in a wrap with hoop earrings. That seems to, at least for her debut season, that was a look that she repeated. But I think to answer Robert's question, it's actually helpful for me to bring in Katherine Dunham a little bit, who, as I said, was performing at around the same time as Primus. So we might think of Dunham as being more in the artistic lineage of Josephine Baker. She was doing these commercialized Broadway, very glamorous review type shows. And, you know, what one gets a sense of when one reads the reviews is this definite kind of desire that is elicited, you know, between Dunham and her audience members. And with Primus, it's something different. I wouldn't say that there's like not an eroticization of her body at all. However, many of the critics comment that she's overweight or they don't think she looks like a dancer. So, you know, there's not that like desiring effect that one reads in the reviews of Dunham's work. So I don't know how much that actually speaks to the clothing, but that definitely is something I would like to explore further, and particularly for her costumes, for her African ceremonial works. I would be interested to, I'd be interested to learn if she was bringing back certain elements of the costumes from her field work, or if she was designing these herself and having them made in a wardrobe workshop of some sort in New York. But those are questions for a future project.
Thank you. So Christine, do you have a kind of quick take on all these shrinking aspects of the costume in some of these caricatures?
Sure.
I would say they're caricatures, but maybe they're cartoons. How do you identify them?
Oh gosh, that's that's tricky. Some people have laid that out very separately, so I don't even know if I have the mastery over the terminology to go into it here. And I just want to say, Linden, gosh, I would love to hear more about those critiques of whether the body is desirous or not, and how they're constructing that criteria. And I think that relates to Lesdi's too. That's fascinating to me. To give the short answer, a lot of scholars before me have talked about the invention of the sack suit in the 20th century, this boxy suit that's supposed to automatically give you this masculine physique. And Eric Segal's work on Norman Rockwell has looked at his advertisements and how Norman Rockwell is, along with other advertisers, showing you can buy clothes to shape your masculine physique. So what I find interesting in this Saturday Evening Post covers, very much like those college humor magazines, that they really try to emphasize that it doesn't work. It's a complete fiction, and really the only person it fools is the wearer. It's almost like an Emperor's New Clothes. These kids go out thinking they have a masculine physique that they haven't earned, they just put on, but everybody can see the fallacy in it.
Oh, well, that fits with a lot of costume, I would say, and issues around fashion and gender and so on. So that's really interesting, because I hadn't thought about his work in that context. But Lesdi, we have a question from Robert Hayden, who asked, did Sánchez build her own painting supports, or do you call them paintings? Are they paintings?
She calls them erotic topologies, and so I've defaulted for her own terminologies because they definitely allied, right, the categories of painting and or sculpture. Yeah, so she does. So Sánchez now is about 96 years old, I believe. She used to make the armatures herself, and there was a slide that kind of shows her much younger, or not much younger, but younger, with one of the armature supports. And then later in life, she solicited the help of assistants who are actually her former students, because she holds a really, she's really ingrained in kind of pedagogical praxis in Puerto Rico, and is really into kind of teaching and thinking about art beyond aesthetics, beyond limitations, beyond, you know, these categories that she's trying to undiscipline. So she's invested in that, and from there, she's been able to work with a lot of her former students as assistants who've helped her build. But yeah, it's a very involved process. From the interviews, it seems that there is a lot of carpentry involved. And it's interesting to note, actually, that during her time in Cuba, she was working as a theater set designer. So again, these themes of theater are coming through. So yeah, just interesting things to note.
Well, unfortunately, we still have questions from the audience, but I've already overshot the amount of time I think that we actually have allotted to us. So I want to thank, you know, if we were in the auditorium, there would be a resounding applause for your professionalism, the ways in which you can, delivered your papers and conceived them before that, but also your ability to respond on your feet to these kinds of questions and really open out the conversation. So I want to congratulate each of you, and I hope we're going to hear more, both about these particular topics, but also just more what you guys are going to be doing. And so stay tuned with each other, stay in touch with the Getty. I'm sure Rebecca and her team will want to, be able to follow you into your dissertations and beyond. And so I want to thank you and your faculty sponsors for, a really, really interesting first session. And I just say you hold your own with whatever's coming in the next 2 days, I'm sure. Thank you. So turning it over to Rebecca.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Nancy, Christine, Linden, and Lesdi, for such an engaging start to our symposium. So 3 really great papers. And Nancy, thank you for leading us through a really dynamic discussion. I feel like we could continue probably for another hour at least. And I hope that some of these themes and ideas will be continued into the conversation tomorrow. This does conclude our first session, but we don't have to say goodbye, as I'm looking forward to seeing everyone back here tomorrow, same place, same time for session 2. So again, thank you, and to be continued.